Opium. It's roughly 3400 BC in ancient Sumer, modern-day Iraq, and someone has just figured out that if you slice open the seed pod of a certain flower and collect the milky sap that leaks out, you get a substance that makes pain disappear and fills you with warm, dreamy euphoria. The Sumerians call it hulgil, the joy plant. And with that one discovery, humanity's oldest and most complicated relationship with a drug begins. This isn't speculation, by the way. It's written down. Clay tablets from this period record poppy cultivation in explicit detail, which makes opium the earliest psychoactive substance we have in writing. The knowledge spread from the Sumerians to the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Egyptians, and by around 1300 BC, opium was being cultivated at scale across Egypt and traded up and down the ancient world. Egyptian doctors prescribed it for headaches, for insomnia, for surgery, for what they described as sadness of the mind. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, lists opium remedies among its hundreds of prescriptions. Even the tomb of Tutankhamun is believed to have contained opium residue among the provisions meant to carry him into the afterlife. And it didn't stop with Egypt. When the Greeks got hold of opium, they built mythology around it. The god of sleep, Hypnos, is depicted holding poppies. The god of dreams, Morpheus, the same name that gives us the word morphin, is surrounded by them. Homer even hints at it in the Odyssey, describing a drug slipped into wine that erased grief and pain entirely. Most historians think that's opium poeticized. The Romans took it even further. Several Roman emperors are recorded as regular users, and Marcus Aurelius, one of the most celebrated philosophers in human history, reportedly took it daily on the advice of his own physician Galen, while writing Meditations, a text still assigned in university courses 2,000 years later. Greek soldiers are said to have taken it before battle to dull the fear of death, which, if true, means opium wasn't just medicine, it was military equipment. Here's the part that should really sit with you. For roughly 4,000 years, nobody thought opium was a problem. There was no concept of addiction, no stigma, no panic. It was simply the best medicine available, and it worked. It took until the industrial era for anyone to seriously ask whether a substance that makes you feel incredible every single time might come with a catch. Cannabis. Around 440 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote something that sounded frankly unbelievable. He described a nomadic people called the Scythians, who during funerals would climb into a small enclosed tent, throw seeds onto red-hot stones, and inhale the smoke that rose up, shouting with what he called joy. For over 2,000 years, historians treated this as an exaggeration, maybe even a myth. Then in 1929, Soviet archaeologists cracked open a frozen burial mound in the Altai Mountains of Siberia and found the proof sitting right there, bronze censers. Charred cannabis seeds, sealed inside tombs from exactly the era Herodotus was writing about. He hadn't been exaggerating at all. The Scythians dominated the Eurasian steppe from around the 9th century BC onward, and cannabis wasn't just a funeral custom for them. Residue found on ancient textiles and burnt plant matter across multiple Scythian sites suggests it was inhaled communally on a regular basis, likely for both ritual purposes and simple recreation. And it turns out the story goes even deeper. In 2019, researchers analyzing wooden censers from a cemetery high in the Pamir Mountains of western China found cannabis residue with unusually high levels of THC, dated to around 500 BC. Which means some ancient populations weren't just using whatever cannabis grew wild, they appear to have already been selecting stronger plants on purpose. Ancient civilizations were breeding better weed 2,500 years ago, and it wasn't only the Scythians. Traces of cannabis have turned up in burial sites across Central Asia and western China from roughly the same era, suggesting the practice moved along the same trade corridors that would later become the Silk Road, centuries before the Silk Road had a name. Coca. Coca leaf chewing in the Andes goes back roughly 8,000 years, long before any empire existed to claim it. But when the Inca rose to power in the 15th century, they turned coca into something much more calculated. It became a state resource. The Inca government controlled who was allowed to grow it and who was allowed to chew it. Commoners needed permission, usually granted only for grueling labor or religious duty. Priests and nobility, on the other hand, had it whenever they wanted. Coca helped combat the exhaustion and oxygen deprivation of high-altitude life, which alone would explain its popularity, but its role went far beyond the physical. Leaves were offered to mountain spirits called apus, burned in ceremonies to the sun god Inti, and buried alongside the dead as provisions for the next world. And then there's the darker evidence. Spanish colonial accounts and later frozen mummies recovered from Andean peaks, particularly children sacrificed in a ritual called capacocha, have been found with coca leaves still present, a plant offered to gods on a mountaintop and placed in the mouth of a child being sent to meet them. The same plant that, centuries later and almost unrecognizably refined, the entire world would come to associate with an industrial narcotic trade the Inca could never have imagined. It's worth sitting with how differently that same leaf functioned depending on who was holding it. In the hands of a laborer hauling stone up a mountain, it was fuel to survive the day. In the hands of a priest, it was a bridge to the gods. In the hands of the state, it was a tool for deciding who got either Teonanácatl In the Aztec Empire, there was a name for psilocybin mushrooms that translates almost exactly to that, flesh of the gods. Spanish missionary Bernardino de Sahagún documented Aztec mushroom ceremonies firsthand in the 1500s, describing participants who wept, who saw visions, who consumed the mushrooms during major events including the coronation of rulers. And this practice was old even by Aztec standards. Stone carvings known as mushroom stones, some depicting figures fused with mushroom caps, have been found across Guatemala and southern Mexico dating back more than 2,000 years, meaning the tradition was likely inherited from the Maya and possibly the Olmec before the Aztec Empire even existed. When the Spanish arrived, they treated the ritual as literal devil worship. They burned codices, they prosecuted practitioners under the Inquisition. And by every reasonable expectation, that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The tradition survived underground for 4 centuries in remote communities in Oaxaca, until 1955, when an American banker and amateur mushroom enthusiast named R. Gordon Wasson was invited to participate in a ceremony led by a healer named Maria Sabina. His account, published in Life magazine in 1957, is widely credited as the moment psilocybin mushrooms entered Western consciousness. 400 years after an empire tried to erase a ritual completely, that ritual reshaped a completely different civilization's culture on the other side of the planet. Wasson's article is credited, directly or indirectly, with inspiring a wave of Western researchers and countercultural figures to seek out psilocybin for themselves, which means a tradition the Spanish Inquisition spent a century trying to stamp out, ended up influencing global culture more in the 20th century than it ever did in the 16th. Number 5. Betel nut, the habit that never stopped. This one is different from everything else on this list, because it never actually went away. Betel nut chewing, technically the erica nut wrapped in a betel leaf, often with a bit of lime, is one of the oldest continuously practiced stimulant habits on the planet. Archaeologists have found stained teeth at burial sites in Thailand and the Philippines dating back roughly 4,600 years, which tells you people were chewing this stuff before most of the civilizations on this list even existed. And unlike opium or Soma or Coca, Betel was never locked behind a priesthood or a royal court. It was for everyone. It spread from India and Sri Lanka across Southeast Asia and into the Pacific Islands, functioning as something close to the ancient equivalent of a coffee break. Ancient Indian medical texts describe it as a digestive aid and a breath freshener, and it became so socially embedded that offering Betel to a guest was considered basic hospitality, a custom that in some regions is still alive today. Royal courts in Sri Lanka and southern India even had ornate gold and silver containers built specifically to hold it, some of which survive in museums right now. The active ingredient, an alkaloid called erycoline, produces mild euphoria and alertness, which is presumably why cultures thousands of miles apart, with zero contact with each other, all landed on the exact same habit independently. And here's the number that should put this whole list in perspective. Betel nut is still chewed today by an estimated several hundred million people. Every other drug on this list is a historical artifact you'd need a museum or an archaeologist to encounter. This one you could find at a corner shop in Mumbai or Manila this afternoon. Number 6. Soma, the drug that became a religion and then disappeared. Somewhere around 1500 BC in ancient India, priests of the Vedic tradition were performing their most sacred ritual, centered on a drink called Soma, pressed from a plant, filtered through wool, mixed with milk, and consumed to enter states the texts describe as divine communion. Soma is mentioned over 100 times in the Rigveda, one of the oldest religious texts that exists anywhere in the world, and an entire book of it, the 9th mandala, is devoted to nothing but Soma. One hymn reads, roughly translated, that the drinker has become immortal and reached the light that the gods themselves discovered. This wasn't a minor ritual ingredient. This was the center of an entire religion's spiritual experience, and here's the part that makes it genuinely strange. Nobody today knows what Soma actually was. The plant may have gone extinct, the knowledge of how to identify it may have been lost, or the trade routes that supplied it may have simply dried up. By the time later Vedic commentary was written, the priests already seemed to be guessing. In 1968, a researcher named R. Gordon Wasson, the same person from the mushroom story earlier, published a theory that Soma was Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted mushroom that looks like it belongs in a video game. Other scholars point to ephedra, a stimulant plant that would explain the Rigveda's descriptions of superhuman energy. Some think it was a blend of multiple plants working together. None of it is settled. An entire ancient civilization built one of its most sacred texts around a substance, and the identity of that substance remains one of the great unsolved mysteries in the history of religion. Somewhere in the gap between the Rigveda's hymns and modern botany, a plant that made people feel like gods simply slipped out of human memory, and every theory since has just been an educated guess at what was lost. Number 7. Kykeon, and the secret that 2,000 years couldn't crack. For nearly 2 millennia, the most important religious rite in the Greek world wasn't held in the Parthenon. It was held at Eleusis, a small town outside Athens, in a ceremony so secret that describing what happened inside was a crime punishable by death. The initiate list reads like a highlight reel of ancient thought. Plato participated, Cicero participated. Both described the experience as one of the most profound things a human being could undergo. And at the center of it all was a drink called Kykeon, made, according to the surviving recipe, from barley, water, and mint, which on paper doesn't sound like it should produce a life-altering mystical experience. So what actually happened inside that hall? One theory, proposed by a group of researchers that includes Albert Hofmann, the chemist who first synthesized LSD, suggests that the barley used in Kykeon was naturally infected with a fungus called ergot, which contains compounds chemically related to LSD. The idea is that Eleusinian priests may have figured out how to prepare the brew in a way that captured the psychoactive effect while filtering out ergot's more dangerous toxicity. It's a striking theory, and it remains genuinely unproven, in part because the secrecy that protected the ritual for 2,000 years also destroyed almost all the direct evidence we could use to confirm it. But it isn't baseless either. In 2020, researchers analyzing a ceremonial drinking vessel from a Mycenaean-era site in Spain tied to similar ritual practices found ergot alkaloids and other plant residue inside. Whatever was actually happening at Eleusis, the men who helped build the intellectual foundation of Western civilization sat in that hall, drank from that cup, and walked out changed. Cicero himself is said to have called the mysteries the single greatest gift Athens ever gave to the rest of the world, which is an extraordinary thing to say about a barley drink unless the barley drink wasn't the whole story. What was really in it remains, appropriately, one of antiquity's best-kept secrets. So there you have it. 7 substances, 7 civilizations, and one very consistent theme running underneath all of them. Opium ran the ancient medical world for 4,000 years before anyone considered it a problem. Cannabis turned out to be exactly as widespread among the Scythians as one skeptical Greek historian claimed, and the frozen evidence proved him right. Coca was sacred enough to offer to gods and controlled enough to ration like currency. Teonanácatl survived an empire's deliberate attempt to destroy it and resurfaced on the other side of the world 4 centuries later. Betel nut never needed a comeback because it never actually left, and it's still in use by hundreds of millions of people today. Soma became so central to an entire religion that losing the plant somehow didn't stop the ritual from continuing. And Kykeon may have quietly fed some of history's greatest philosophical minds a substance chemically related to LSD without any of them ever being allowed to say so. The thing that stands out after going through all of this isn't that ancient civilizations used drugs. It's how deliberately, how ritually, and how seriously they used them. These weren't accidents or side notes in history. For a lot of these societies, the drug wasn't separate from the religion, the medicine, or the politics. It was the foundation underneath all 3. Strip away the modern framing of drugs as a vice to be managed or a crisis to be solved, and what's left is a much older, much stranger relationship. One where a plant or a fungus or a mushroom wasn't just tolerated by a civilization, but actively built into the architecture of how that civilization understood pain, power, and the divine. We like to think of the ancient world as simpler than ours. Judging by this list, they were running some of the same chemistry we are, they just hadn't invented the guilt yet.